Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Tamina Watson, your moderator for the next hour. The event is called Stop the Incinerator, the High Cost of Green Card Slots Going Unused and the Benefits of Recapturing Them. Thank you to the Niskanen Center for this incredible and topical and very, very important subject matter on which they have written a very important report. If you haven't read it, it's on the website and you'll be hearing all about it in the next hour. I am Tamina Watson. I am an immigration attorney in Seattle, Washington at Watson Immigration Law. I have the privilege of being an adjunct fellow at the Niskanen Center. My practice is business immigration law. So I see people on a very daily basis who are affected by the issue that we will discuss today. The visas that I see all the time are H-1Bs and Ls, and people are coming from different countries. The impact on people is very real. And with a moment where we can actually address these issues, today's topical issue will be very relevant. And I hope that you will ask questions at the end where we will have about 10 to 15 minutes. So thank you so much. I want to introduce our panelists today. We have Jeremy Neufeld from the Niskanen Center. Jeremy is an immigration policy analyst at the Niskanen Center, where his work focuses on the economic analysis of immigration, temporary worker programs, and international education. He has a BS in economics from the University of Maryland, College Park, and is currently an economics PhD student at George Mason University. His research has been cited in the Washington Post, Bloomberg, the LA Times, and elsewhere. Welcome, Jeremy. Thank you for being here. Our next panelist is Lindsay Milliken from the Federation of American Scientists. Lindsay is a policy analyst for science, technology, and innovation at the Federation of American Scientists. She supports both the Congressional Science Policy Initiative and the Technology and Innovation Initiative. Her work focuses on developing timely policy solutions to attract highly skilled workers to the United States in critical technology areas such as artificial intelligence, in addition to forging closer connections between the US scientific community and Congress. Lindsay received her BA in political science with a minor in physics from the American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Lindsay. Thank you for being here. And Doug Rand, who was the third author of the report, sends his apologies. He has a conflict and wasn't able to attend today, but he will be watching the video. Well, we're going to waste no more time and go straight into the questions. Lindsay, tell us about the visa quota system. We have a complicated system that is very difficult for people to understand. So can you break it down for us, please?
Sure, and I just want to start with saying thank you so much for inviting me and for hosting this webinar, Niskanen Center, and also Tamina for on such an important topic. So each year, over 1 million people are approved for lawful permanent residency, which is also known as obtaining a green card in the United States. And most people fall into one of two categories. This is either family-based green cards or employment-based green cards. And the family-based green cards are typically sponsored by either US citizens or permanent residents that are already living in the United States. And employment-based green cards are sponsored by the person who's obtaining the green cards, their employer. Besides the green cards for immediate relatives, which are spouses, unmarried children under 21 years old, or parents of US citizens, both family-based and employment-based green cards have caps. So the family-based green card cap amounts to about 226,000 green cards per year. And the employment-based cap is about 140,000 per year. And this includes the spouses and minor children of the primary worker. So there's another restriction that goes along with these green card caps, is that individuals from a particular country of origin cannot be awarded more than 7% of the total number of family preference or employment-based green cards. And so this means that individuals from countries with a high volume of green cards like India, Mexico, China, or the Philippines have to wait 80 years or more, which would effectively be your entire lifetime, to attain a green card. And sometimes the green cards that are allotted each year are not used. With the passage of the Immigration Act of 1990, Congress sought to reduce the number of green cards that were unused. And so the intention was that if there are any unused green cards in one category, they would fall across in the next fiscal year to the other green card category. Family preference, if there are more family preference-based green cards than can be used in 1 year, they would go to employment-based, for example. However, this process rarely works in the opposite direction, which would be employment-based green cards being used for the family-based category. If fewer than 140,000 employment-based green cards are used each year, they almost never fall across. And this is an unintended consequence of Congress not being able to predict the immigration flows after the passage of the Immigration Act of 1990. As the law is currently implemented, employment-based green cards only fall across to family-based categories when the total number of immediate relative green cards for spouses, minor children under 21, and those types of categories, if the number of those immediate relative green cards plus the number of unused employment-based green cards is less than 254,000. But this hasn't happened in over 20 years. So as the total number of immediate relative green cards are distributed each year, and as that number has grown significantly, the number of family preference green cards that are allotted ends up being set at the statutory minimum of 226,000. So even if there are unused green cards in the employment-based category, they end up not counting in the family-based category the next fiscal year. And this is what we call the Incinerator. And so this was not intended by Congress, most likely, and predicting future flows of immigration is extremely complicated. So this is a significant problem that needs to be remedied.
Well, thank you so much for that breakdown. You touched on it a little bit, but when Congress came up with this sort of structure and framework, had they ever intended for these to be unused? When you talked about crossover, explain a little bit more about that.
So at the time, the number of immediate relatives coming to the United States was not as high, not even close to as high as it is now. And so at the time, that calculation would end up working, and letting the employment-based green cards fall across into the family-based categories. But as we've seen a significant increase in the number of immediate relatives coming to the United States, then the equation that Congress put together in the Immigration Act of 1990 falls apart.
Well, 1990 and it's 2021. I mean, it's been a few decades where it's time our laws change. So let's talk a little bit about the situations that led to the unused visas. And I know you've created a very handy dandy chart. So if I can take a moment to pull that up, people will be able to see that while you speak. So describe what situation led to the unused visas and describe this chart to us.
Sure. So in a normal year, there is a little bit of waste that goes along with calculating the number of people who get green cards. Sometimes it's caused by bureaucratic delays. More specifically, the State Department basically has to estimate how many people in the green card queue can be given a green card by the end of the fiscal year. And they try to get as close to the cap as possible, but they do not want to exceed that cap. So sometimes their estimates fall a little bit short. But the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly exacerbated this problem. And this is what this graphic shows here is that, um, and you can see in the family-based section, which are the circles at the top of the graphic, and the employment-based circles are at the bottom. The total number of family-based green cards is the whole circle, while the number that are able to be processed are in the dotted line. So in a normal year, these we would, so FY 2020 is generally representative of what the last normal year was. But in FY 2021 is where we start to see some problems. So most employment-based green cards are processed inside the United States as adjustments of status from temporary visas like the H-1B. And most family-based green cards are processed at consular offices outside the United States. So because of the pandemic, a lot of those consular offices shut down in March of last year, bringing the visa interview process to basically to a grinding halt. And these interviews, as you may know, are basically vital to getting your family-based green card. And so you can see by this significantly smaller circle in the family-based category in FY 2021 is basically a representation of the number of visas that were able to be processed by the consular offices decreased significantly.
Lindsay, I'm going to ask you a quick question because a lot of people who have joined may not be savvy to the term FY 2020 or these. Can you explain for context that timeline so that we can actually picture it considering what's going on in the world?
Sure. So FY stands for fiscal year, which ends on September 30th each year. So the September 30th, 2021 will be the last year of the last day of the fiscal year 2021. And then October 1st will be the start of fiscal year 2022.
So can we just talk about, so when we talk about what's happening in the world, October 2019 is where this chart really begins. Is that correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, so this was the last, so FY 2020 was essentially the last time that this was a normal distribution, a normal processing state for the government. And so when the consular offices closed, the capacity for them to process green card applications decreased dramatically. And you can see in the FY 2021 employment-based circle, the capacity has generally been the same. It increased a little bit, the circle increased a little bit because some family-based green cards fell across to the employment-based category as they do when they're extras like we talked about earlier. And you can see there's a little fire icon at the bottom, which demonstrates the extra employment-based green cards, which get incinerated at the end of the fiscal year, which is why we are talking about recapturing them here. And this problem is just going to get worse, essentially, is that because they were not able to process enough family-based applications during this last year, all of those extra family-based green cards are going to roll over to the employment-based category in the following fiscal year. And so you can see from this much larger circle, the pot of extra employment-based green cards is going to be too much for the current capacity of USCIS to process them. And essentially what happens is that once the end of the next fiscal year comes, there's going to be a significant number of those employment-based green cards that have not been processed. And then because, as we discussed, they are not able to be transferred over to the family-based category because of mistakes made during the Immigration Act of 1990 in their equation, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of green cards that end up becoming incinerated at the end of that fiscal year.
Wow, that's a lot of green cards. I mean, you know, as an immigration attorney, I I get calls every day about people who are waiting to maybe buy a house or take another job or have a baby. And, these have real life impacts on people. And so thank you so much for breaking it down in that way. And so let's go to Jeremy. The question that naturally comes from this is, how many unused visas do we in fact have then?
Thanks, Tamina. I think it's best to break that down into two component questions. The first is how many visas have ever gone unused? And then there's a second question, how many of those unused visas are in fact available for recapture? And the first question, how many visas have ever gone unused? From 1990 to 2020, so again, this does not include all of these additional visas which might get lost because of COVID, but from 1990 to 2020, the number is 941,000 visas have gone unused. So nearly a million, that's almost a full year of immigration that just got potentially wiped out. Of those, just over half were employment-based, so 519,000 employment-based visas never got used, and 421,000 family-based or family preference visas never got used. Now the question of how many of those 941,000 unused green cards are available for recapture depends on the specific recapture plan. I'm sure we'll talk more about a number of the different plans that are going around later. But there is one plan, the U.S. Citizenship Act, which would recapture all of those. If Congress were to recapture visas as they have in the past, that would screen out all of those family preference visas which have fallen across to employment-based visas, and so that number would be reduced by about 421,000 family preference visas which were unused in 1 year but fell across, and then it would additionally reduce that by 180,000 visas which have previously been recaptured by Congress. So that leaves still 340,000 visas which were never used, didn't fall across, and would still be available for recapture. And then if the administration were to proceed with recapture, there would still be about 232,000 unused visas available for the administration to recapture on its own. And again, that just goes through 2020, and there's a big risk that in just a few months, that number could increase by over 100,000 because of unused visas during COVID-19.
Wonderful. I'm going to come back to the administrative and congressional recapture again in just a moment. But, a lot of people will be wondering, why is this a problem? And so can you elaborate on why this is a problem for America as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. So even if the number of unused visas in a given year, and this before COVID, in the previous 10 years, the number in any given year wasn't that high. But the cumulative effect of all of these visas going unused is an enormous shortfall in the number of immigrants in the United States below what Congress authorized and intended and planned for. USCIS was alerted to the issue in 2007, and they've done an okay job at correcting that. But even thousands of visas going unused, which is low for their history, is still thousands of people who are being added to green card waiting lists and backlogs who wouldn't otherwise be there, who Congress had every intention would be in the country legally with lawful permanent residency. That makes the wait time longer for everyone else, and potentially even worse, that burden doesn't fall evenly over everyone who is waiting in line legally for a green card, but it does disproportionately fall on immigrants who come from countries that are subject to the per country caps. And so this burden isn't even spread across all immigrants equally, but it falls on a subset of them. And all of that doesn't even mention that this cumulative shortfall of immigrants in the United States is a persistent drag on the U.S. economy, because these immigrants could be contributing much more to the U.S. than they're right now being allowed to.
Yeah, and I think for anybody watching who's wondering why does it matter to America, I think, you know, as a practitioner, I see what businesses have to do to apply for these visas. They go through a lot of, you know, tedious work to fulfill the requirements of getting these visas approved. They spend a lot of time and energy away from their actual, you know, job duties to do this. And they actually spend a lot of money and resources on actually trying to get these workers to their businesses. So from an employment-based visa perspective, it truly is a drain on the economy when it comes to businesses, because they can't simply fill those positions for which they have spent so much time and energy. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Lindsay, just to ask you, do you have any thoughts on the American economy and the effects?
I have to second everything that Jeremy has said. It is a significant problem that, especially with COVID, is only going to get worse. And so it's very important it's great we're talking about it now, but it is important to make sure that this gets translated into action in the future.
Wonderful. So I'm going to come back to what Jeremy was talking about. So you talked about recapturing and how it can be done. In the report, you've talked about essentially three options. There's the administrative and there's the congressional. Can you elaborate on the administrative recapture option?
Sure. Is that a question?
For Lindsay, yes. Why do you believe the administration can actually recapture these visas?
Great. Well, thanks for the question. Well, first of all, the executive branch should really ensure that the current and future green card applicants are not unfairly penalized by any delays that are outside of their control. And it's also needless to say that the administration must act quickly to implement some sort of solution, especially given the looming fiscal year deadline that's only getting worse from COVID. The Department of Homeland Security, working with the State Department, can adopt new policies that reserve available green cards for immigrants once the State Department's visa bulletin confirms that a green card is available for an individual immigrant, regardless of whether USCIS or the State Department can process that paperwork that year, essentially saving their spot for them. Next, the executive branch should move to retroactively recapture approximately 232,000 green card slots that have been lost to bureaucratic error in the decades prior to fiscal year 2020. And these agencies could also apply new visa counting policy retroactively to recapture green cards that have gone unused before any new policies have gone into effect. And actually, this is how the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which is the predecessor to USCIS, and the State Department previously changed their policies concerning how to count immigrants under the Cuban Adjustment Act. And they've also retroactively recaptured green card slots for immigrants coming from the Western Hemisphere.
Wonderful. Well, I'm gonna. Did you have anything else to add to that, Lindsay?
No, that is all.
That's really eye-opening, actually. Jeremy, I have a question about the economy. So when we're talking about the administrative recapture, is there an economic impact to this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I mean, any way that visas are recaptured and go from being unused and incinerated to being restored back to the levels that Congress intended and actually getting put into the hands of immigrants, that's definitely going to have a positive impact on the economy, however way it's done. I mean, whether the administration does it or Congress doesn't, the green cards are ultimately going to provide the same benefits to immigrants and to the economy. It's going to allow people to come to the U.S., innovate here, bring their valuable talents here, bring new ideas to the teams that they work on here, and it will expand the tax base here and help stave off some of the detrimental effects of demographic decline. And like you were talking about earlier, when visas go unused, companies can't expand, and the economy is deprived of the talents of the people who would otherwise have those visas. So in our paper, we do try to quantify the economic benefits from recapturing these visas. And so in the specific administrative scenario that we look at, we estimate that if they were recaptured this year, over the next 10 years, it would add over $216 billion in economic activity. And then on top of that, that's in addition to estimate about $90 billion in net revenue to federal, state, and local governments. And so this is a big, both an economic boon and a fiscal boon. And as we talk about in our paper, there's every reason to believe that these estimates are quite conservative and that we're probably understating the actual, the true measure of the increase in economic growth from recapturing visas, because we don't account for the boost to productivity, which go from green cards going to migrants who are already here, both to themselves, to the fact that a green card ensures that there's work opportunities for their spouses, that their children can stay in the country and contribute when they become adults. And it just makes the US more attractive because the waiting time is slightly less long than it might otherwise be. So all this is to say, there are tremendous economic benefits to the United States, and administrative recapture alone would include hundreds of billions of dollars of that.
Wow, I mean, that's an astronomical number. And if the audience, I just want to repeat it for them, administrative recapture will allow us to gain in the next 10 years $216 billion. That's billion dollars, and then $90 billion in state and local revenue. I mean, that's a lot of money just from administrative recapture. I'm going to come back to you, Jeremy, but I'm going to go to Lindsay to ask about the two congressional fixes that you mentioned in the report. Can you take us through each one of those?
Sure. And, I also welcome Jeremy to add anything if he would like to as well. But so there are two congressional fixes that we talk about in the paper. Congress can amend the American Competitiveness in the 21st Century Act, which has already recaptured about 180 unused employment-based green cards. And if, amended, it could recapture over 339,000 additional unused green cards, which would add about $104 billion to the GDP over 10 years. Our second congressional proposal that we talk about in our paper is if the recapture provisions that were included in the U.S. Citizenship Act were signed into law, over 940,000 unused employment-based and family preference green cards would be recaptured. And that would actually add about $815 billion to the GDP over 10 years.
Thanks, Lindsay. That's great. I just want to give a little more context on the American Competitiveness in the 21st Century Act, because this really is the where a lot of the precedent for congressional recapture comes from. So this was a Republican proposal from the I think the 106th Congress that recaptured unused visas from 1999 and 2000. And it showed that recapture could be done. It showed significant economic benefits, so much so that in 2005, they amended it to include some additional visas from other years that hadn't already been recaptured. But because it's so narrowly limited to 1999, 2000, and then only 50,000 of unused visas from every other year, there's still hundreds of thousands of unused visas left on the table that could easily be recaptured just by a simple amendment to that bill. And I would also just say that that seems to be one of the ways that Congress has been recently considering recapturing. So For instance, last year there was discussion about the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act, and there was a push to have that included in a COVID relief package, but that would have amended the American Competitiveness in the 21st Century Act to include, again, additional years, and then allocate those visas to a specific purpose. But so the American Competitiveness Act is in many ways a framework for other potential visa recaptures, but not the only framework that's out there.
That's very helpful to know. And so, Jeremy, coming back to you, since we all believe that the economy could benefit from these recaptures, why hasn't it happened yet?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to note is like I was saying about the American Competitiveness Act, it has happened a couple of times. So there definitely is precedent for it, and Congress has successfully recaptured 180,000 visas already. They haven't done it that recently, and so the question is, why haven't they done the remaining ones? I mean, I think there's an opportunity for them to do that. But I think the largest reason is just, I mean, the larger issue about why immigration reform in general is very difficult, because it's hard to do standalone immigration bills. If members of both parties, if there's an immigration bill, even if it starts out somewhat narrow, other people want to add their own priorities, and everything snowballs into an enormous immigration package, which we've had trouble passing.
So based on what you just said, is there any chance of Congress recapturing these green cards then in the near future? Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's some hope that Congress can proceed and end up recapturing visas. I think it would be impossible for them to do it as a standalone bill, but it could be included as part of a larger must-pass not non-immigration, just a larger must-pass bill where immigration is just a narrow part of it, and specifically recapture. So I mentioned the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act, which could be included as part of a must-pass COVID bill. And there's also appropriations bills. So just yesterday, the House Appropriations Committee included in a Dhs Funding Bill provisions which would which would recapture some visas, not all of the visas that we talk about in our report, but specifically visas from 2020 and 2021, which went unused specifically because of COVID. And one of the interesting things about that bill, or that amendment, I should say, is that it also includes other visa categories which typically never went unused in the past. So for instance, unused diversity visas, but which for the first time have started to go unused because of COVID, which has never really been a part of the recapture discussion before now. So outside of Dhs funding, there's also some possibility that recapture could be included in a reconciliation bill. There's again some precedent for this. In 2005, Senate Republicans added recapture to a reconciliation bill that ended up getting stripped out of the final version. But again, it shows that it seems like the kind of thing that could be included in reconciliation. Obviously, the parliamentarian today might disagree, but there is precedent for that, and that would be one avenue by which recapture could proceed. And if it doesn't happen this year, I mean, there's appropriations bills every year, as well as budget reconciliations. And so there is some opportunity here for recapture to move forward. And to do so, I think would be especially beneficial now. I mean, we saw that in the economic recovery from the 2008 economic recession. Some of the lack and shortfalls in visa categories have been estimated to slow down the economic recovery. And so as we're recovering from COVID, now would seem to be an especially good time to recapture these visas.
Well, legally, it's very interesting to see these issues. I mean, you're right that the diversity visa issue never had recapture as as an issue to deal with before, and it's not necessarily specifically, discussed anywhere. So that's interesting. A lot of people might be wondering, Jeremy, you've mentioned the appropriations bill and possibly a reconciliation that could come up. For anybody who wants to continue tracking these issues that are trending and happening as we speak, where can they look?
I mean, there's plenty of sources online to follow the goings on in Congress. Congress.gov would obviously be the main source for the text of all of these bills and amendments.
Okay, so congress.gov. So anybody listening, if you're interested in following up from what Jeremy said about the appropriations bill, you can follow the bill from congress.gov. We are going to be opening up for questions in a moment, so do get ready for your questions. We'll definitely take them. I'll get my window open here. And so I do want to just give an overview of what I've seen as a practitioner and how all of this sort of comes together. As soon as March 2020 happened, of course, the world stopped. And a lot of people who were in the green card line, so to speak, who had interviews about to be scheduled or even scheduled, they had them immediately stopped. And, both from the consular processing perspective, embassies really did shut down and these interviews didn't happen. And I have clients in different parts of the world, and the surge in India happened recently. And some of my clients have been affected by COVID. And, a few of them have seen some tragedies where those visas are really going to be unused because they were, directed to somebody's parent who's no longer alive. So there's definitely that aspect. And then what I've seen in the US is I have clients who have been waiting for their green card interviews in the US, and they simply haven't been able to get past go. And in that situation, as you file the application and you wait for biometrics, and there are, different steps to happen. Not many of those steps have happened. So the backlog as we speak is growing because hundreds of thousands of these interviews are generally scheduled, daily at both embassies and in the US. So the problem isn't going to get any better. So I'm going to come to some of the questions. Are you ready for some questions, Lindsay and Jeremy? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so question one comes from GR. What is in the US interest skilled immigrants who lived here for years or family? What is in the US interest skilled immigrants who lived here for years or family relatives? Why are employment-based backlogs for India not a concern for administration or previous administrations? I will take that just a minute before I throw it over to you. I think, it's not that nobody cares, in my opinion. It's more like the system is so complicated. And, that's exactly why this discussion has happened and why Jeremy, Lindsay, and Doug have put so much time into figuring out where the processes have broken down. So that would be my opinion. But Lindsay, Jeremy, one of you want to take this?
Sure. I think as far as what of this is in the U.S. interest, I definitely think that there's a strong interest in both expanding the amount of green cards that are issued, putting aside the debate about what the total number should be, at least up until the point that Congress has allocated. And then I think the issue about per country caps is still relevant to this conversation, largely as the point that the burden of green cards going unused falls on specifically countries that are people from countries who are subject to the per country caps. But I think both recapture and this other point about per country caps are largely two separate issues that both go toward the same end. One is by making sure that the number of visas is actually going out the door, and the second is how those visas get allocated to people who are in line. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, with all of these immigration issues, just immigration reform is a difficult political lift. And so there's some similar dynamics going on with the per country cap legislation, where moving as a standalone thing is a political non-starter.
Thank you, Jeremy. Did you want to add something, Lindsay?
Sure. And just, I mean, I think that your explanation is great. I think that, you know, skilled immigrants and both family relatives are extremely important in making sure that families stay together, and those who want to build careers here and build lives here are both equally very important. And handling the current backlogs is, like Jeremy said, a very complicated and hot button political issue that has so far been difficult to sort through.
Thank you. So I'm going to move on to the next question. It's from one of the attendees who says, why can't the immigration attorneys take legal action against USCIS and DOL for wasting green cards and for acting against congressional intent of issuing the green cards to the applicants in line? So I'm going to take that for a second as the immigration attorney practicing. It's a really good question, but we have to come back to the basics of why this issue is so complicated. Filing a lawsuit doesn't necessarily get you the result you need. The immigration numbers that you see and what we've just discussed are so complicated that, you know, you need to be truly trained in this issue to be able to get any answer that will work. And so for immigration attorneys, you know, I can't speak for everybody. You know, it's not an easy thing. The other thing I will say, that immigration attorneys do not have standing. You know, one of the questions I have posed to a lot of my clients is, will you want to sue? And the trouble is that without individuals wanting to stand up, it's not necessarily possible. So it's not a lawsuit by the immigration attorneys for the immigration attorneys. There are lots of complexities that need to be taken into account. So it's not just about that. So that would be my take on that. Would you have anything to add, Lindsay and Jeremy?
The only thing I'd have to add is, I mean, courts tend to give a lot of discretion to the executive branch in how they implement statutes passed by Congress. And I think a lawsuit could work. It's possible. I don't know what the answer. I don't know how what the outcome would look like. But courts tend to afford a lot of discretion to the administration, and so it might be a better way forward just for the administration to change how they're implementing it, rather than trying to get the courts to force their hand.
I agree. I mean, you'll find that you know, there's always sort of precedent given to what has already happened. And so, Lindsay, did you want to add anything to that?
I think that you both have explained it very well. And, you know, it's like Jeremy was saying, it might be actually more efficient to change actual government policy as opposed to wait for a lawsuit to run its course through the legal system.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on to the next question. Looking further ahead, in an ideal world, how would we think about green card caps and country restrictions? So I'm going to add a little bit before I throw it back to you. But this question comes up in my practice all the time, you know, where people will say, well, you know, what about the country caps and why are they not being removed? And the attempt has been done. There is a standalone bill for that. But what I often will tell my clients is, we do need comprehensive immigration reform. If you are trying to reform one silo issue without trying to work out all the other problems, you're going to have problems in different ways. And so what I try to explain to my clients is, the ankle bone is connected to the knee bone, that's connected to the hip bone, and so forth. If you just focus on the knee bone, the body's still going to be lopsided. And so that's the way I try to explain it to my clients. And you know, obviously I don't have insight into what Congress will eventually do with the bills that a lot of people are advocating for. But throwing it to you, Lindsay, and then to Jeremy.
Thanks, Tamina. I think, to answer this question at least a little bit, it is such a big issue, is that there have been several proposals suggested about how to either do away with or adjust country restrictions and the caps to most efficiently eliminate backlogs. And, each has each has its own merits. Some include focusing on eliminating backlogs with applicants from China and India, for example, first, before distributing the green cards to the other categories. But they are all deserving of scrutiny and further evaluation to see if something like that could pass in a comprehensive immigration bill in the future.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is to the point about how we should think about green card caps in an ideal world. I mean, I think it's fair to just say that raising the legal level of immigration is probably one of our best levers for economic growth. And so again, abstracting away all the political concerns, increasing green card caps would be good for immigrants. It would be good for Americans. It's a win-win situation. What I think is really interesting about recapture is that it doesn't necessarily abstract away all of these political considerations, because it's a clear case where we don't need to raise the green card caps to at least expect that the government will at least issue the visas that Congress has already provided for. And so, I definitely don't think we should ignore the fact that the green card caps need to be updated. They haven't been updated in 30 years. It's definitely past due for them to do it. But it definitely, we do have to recognize that it's a big political lift. But even if we can't get that accomplished, we should at least expect that the visas that are supposed to be issued under the current system should at least go out. And so it's an interesting point where we can increase the number of green cards without changing the actual numerical limitations and the caps that already do exist.
Thank you, Jeremy. There's some questions are similar, so I'm trying to get to something new. So Jaya Prakash asks, lately there were some changes in filing dates and allowing filing the I-485 based on this filing dates rather than priority dates. But even if these filing dates don't move forward, are not moving fast enough, do you have any insights on this? So I'm going to take this quickly and then I'll pass it over. And just so, people who are watching who may not necessarily understand what happens, the process of applying for a green card is long and tedious, and there are various steps. And the first step is having something called an I-140. That is a form that is filed by the employer after going through a very difficult process of proving that they couldn't find an American worker. And when that I-140 is approved, that actually gets somebody in the quote unquote line. And that is the priority date. But they can't simply file their 485. The 485, the I-485 is the actual green card form. So anybody who's listening, who's not necessarily familiar with these forms, the I-485 is a universal green card application form. Whether you get green cards through diversity visas, asylum, family-based, the ultimate form comes to the 485, and you can only file it when your number is current, your priority, your top of the list. And so what this person is asking is that some people were allowed to file these, and that's not necessarily moving. And I think it comes back to what we saw in fiscal year 2020 and 2021, where some of these numbers hadn't been used. And so, Jayaprakash, the only thing I can say as an immigration attorney is that this discussion today that's happening is really vital to the conversation, because if nothing moves in this big circle, the individual 485s will not move, because it's all interconnected. And so you have to wait and see what happens with interviews progressing at local offices, because the I-485 is for local offices. And then you have to see what happens from all the things that Jeremy and Lindsay have mentioned. So throwing it to you, do you have anything to add, Lindsay and Jeremy?
No, I think you covered it well.
Okay, so the next question. Is there any information on the skill level of green cards that go out to family-based immigrants? It almost makes them sound like they're unskilled. Is that right? So I'm going to take this very question very quickly before I throw it over. You know, family-based is really about family unification. When the 1990 bill was created, it was really because, you know, we're all about family. So they're not necessarily taking that into account. It's really about family relationships. So they're very different criterias and very different grounds for applications for green cards. So I want to make sure people understand they're very, very separate, and the merits for looking at these green cards are also very separate. So Jeremy, throwing this to you.
So there is some information on the skill level based on different immigrant pathways. Unfortunately, the major source of information on the skill levels of these various categories was from the new immigrant survey, which hasn't been done in a little bit of time. If we brought it back, we could get slightly more updated information, but based on the information that we do have, they do tend to have slightly less educational attainment than employment-based immigrants. But one of the interesting things is that they still, even though they do have less educational attainment, the net economic impact of family-based immigrants might actually be higher than the marginal employment-based immigrant green card, because they're more likely to be new arrivals to the country. And so a green card that goes to an employment-based petitioner is likely to go to someone who's already here, whereas a family-based green card is likely to go to someone who can enter the US labor force who isn't already in it. And so they do have a bit less educational attainment, but they are more likely to grow the size of the US economy. And so it's an interesting question, but right now there's a little bit of a trade-off between those two factors.
Lindsay, did you want to add anything?
I think you've both explained it very well. You know, and like you said, they're judged very differently based on family relationships versus professional and academic achievements, which is typically more characteristic of the employment-based green cards.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll just say is, like, it's because there are also like net economic benefits. There's not a trade-off necessarily between family-based green cards and employment-based green cards. Congress can increase both of them, and there's no need to pair them against each other. And family-based immigration is also really important because it makes the U.S. attractive to employment-based immigrants. If we're trying to attract the best and brightest from around the world, and an employee has a job offer from the U.S. and Canada, but the job offer from Canada means that they can bring family members over, and the job offer from the U.S. means they have to go alone and be separated from their families. I think it's clear that it's in the U.S. interest to want to have family sponsorship, because it means that we can attract that person who might even be themselves coming on an employment-based visa. So I think there's a lot of complementarities between these two programs, and it can be mistaken to see them as a zero-sum game rather than things that are complements to one another.
Well said, Jeremy. And you know, I see this from a practitioner perspective. A lot of clients, particularly in the last few years, where they're staying in the backlog, but their spouses, you know, either couldn't work or couldn't progress in what they wanted to do. And a lot of people have left the United States because of it, because they want to stay with their family, and for one reason or another, there are difficulties in that. You know, I'll take one more question because we're about to run out of time, so we're going to have to be very brief with the answer. Birth country caps are impacting only the immigrants from populous countries. It is causing disparity on wait times for green cards based on this issue. So what would you say to that?
I think just to talk a little bit about this, I think it's a very important issue that the government needs to deal with. I mean, they have studies out that say that applicants from India, for example, have to wait 80 years or more. The backlogs are so severe that there are calculations for if everyone stayed in that backlog forever, how long it would take, and how long it would take if people give up or pass away in line, which happens, which is, just the fact that there has to be a calculation for how many years it would take, accounting for people who pass away waiting for a green card, is indicative of a very significant issue we should tackle.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. And I agree with the questioner's point that the per country caps are an issue. I'll just add that recapture relieves some of the issues because it does reduce the backlogs. But I'll also just add that adjusting the per country caps alone doesn't affect the ultimate constraining factor on how much of a tool U.S. immigration can actually be in helping the U.S. So the per country caps do affect how long certain people wait in line, and it does seem like there's a lot of unfairness in that. But even if we got rid of them, the number that are issued each year is still falling below what Congress intended, and it might spread the waiting time. It might make the waiting times more equal across applicants, but it can't reduce the average waiting times. But things like recapture or other things that can actually increase the total number of green cards can reduce the waiting times for everyone, with whether we can eliminate the green card, even if we can eliminate the green card per country caps.
Totally agree. Increasing the numbers is really one of the biggest things we need as part of immigration reform. Well, we're running out of time. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I want to take a moment to say thank you to the Niskanen Center for this report, to Christy DePena, to Matthew LaCourte, to Doug Rand, Jeremy, and Lindsay, because this report and all of the other immigration work you've done recently, particularly, have been so important to the dialogue of making immigration better in this country. So I'm very honored to be here with you and to have been part of this dialogue. What I will say to the people who are listening right now or will tune in later, this report is an important one. Use it. Share it with the people that you want to have your voice heard too. I have learned over the years as an immigrant, as an immigration attorney, that, you can write to people and tell them your story and tell them what you want to see. I actually wrote to President Obama just before he left, asking him to recapture these unused visas. I'll have to dig out that letter. And so everybody can share their stories and do that. And this is an important report. So make sure you share that and share the webinar with your friends. I know a lot of people are going to be interested in hearing about this. So thank you so much to everybody who's joined. Before we say goodbye, I'd like to ask for some last words from Jeremy first and then Lindsay. Jeremy, what would you like to share?
The parting thought I would leave everyone with is simply that this whole recapture conversation is about green cards that Congress has already authorized. And these can be recaptured to generate hundreds of billions of dollars in economic output over the next decade, without having to enter the political debate around total changes to the numerical limitations. If we don't do this, we're leaving billions of dollars on the table, and it's and it's just simply not carrying out the express wishes of Congress in terms of when they last set immigration levels. So just restoring the numbers to what we're supposed to be issuing anyway seems like a no-brainer. Thanks so much again for moderating, Tamina.
Thank you. Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamina. I just wanted to say, thanks to the Niskanen Center and to you for hosting this webinar. And, I really want to just say that while this is a daunting task, I am hopeful that this is something that we can really tackle in, if not this year, but in the coming years, as it's extremely important, not only for deserving people who are waiting in the green card queue, but also important to stimulate the growth of our economy, especially as we are recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Stimulating the economy. That's what we'll leave people with. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. And if you have questions, you can write to us through the Niskanen Center website. Thank you again. And thank you to both of you. Bye-bye for now.